The events take place in Berlin in 1928. The audience is rapturously watching the performance of a magician from the East. He showcased various tricks, making people believe in magic. However, behind the scenes, the whole atmosphere of wonder dissipates. The Eastern magician turns out to be the outstanding illusionist Stanley Crawford. Stanley is dissatisfied with his assistants' work as they're not coordinated and constantly make mistakes. Into Stanley's dressing room came his old acquaintance Howard Birkin to personally congratulate the illusionist on his successful performance. Howard is also a magician and admires Stanley's skills. They hadn't seen each other for a year. Howard asked Stanley how his tour was going. However, after a brief conversation, Howard admitted that he needed help. That's why he came to Stanley. The men went to a bar, where Howard told about the Catledge, the wealthiest family in Pittsburgh who made a huge fortune from coal mining. The problem is that they now host a girl who has convinced them that she can communicate with spirits. Stanley immediately realized that this was about a fraudster. Of course, the girl takes a lot of money for her seance. And Bryce Catledge, the heir to all the wealth, has fallen madly in love with this cunning lady. Bryce's sister Caroline is married to a psychoanalyst who insisted that the woman hold her seances in the presence of two well-known scientists. However, even this did not convince Bryce. Howard himself had seen the woman in action several times. He was embarrassed to admit it, but he never noticed a trick. That's why Howard turned to Stanley for help. Only he can expose the fraud. Stanley, driven by excitement, agreed. The next day he told his fiancée Olivia that he was going to the south of France. Olivia took it calmly. Soon Howard and Stanley set off. The first thing they did was visit Provence to see Vanessa, Stanley's aunt. She was very happy to see them. Vanessa had heard a lot about the gifted medium at the Catledge's house. After a few hours, the men arrived at the luxurious Catledge mansion, where they were met by Caroline and her husband George. Unlike her easily suggestible brother and mother, Caroline does not believe in ghosts and hopes that Stanley will expose the swindler. George said that the girl's name is Sophie Baker, she's an American and is here with her mother. According to Caroline, during the last seance, the table lifted from the floor. They have no idea how Sophie pulled this off, but Stanley is determined to expose her. In the meantime, Bryce was rehearsing a serenade for Sophie, and it sounded awful. Howard introduced Stanley to him, and of course did not mention that he was an illusionist. This is necessary so that Sophie does not suspect anything. Bryce enthusiastically spoke about his beloved Sophie, who among other things can read minds and see the future. Bryce's mother was so impressed with her talents that she decided to sponsor scientific research into parapsychology. Bryce had to step away as he received a call from his office. Howard told Stanley that Bryce doesn't make any business decisions without consulting with Sophie. Soon Sophie herself arrived, holding a seance for the Catledge's wealthy neighbors. Sophie turned out to be charming. Seeing Stanley, she asked if he had come from the East. This surprised Stanley, as his stage image was indeed associated with Asia. However, Stanley wasn't confused and began to compliment Mrs. Baker, Sophie's mother. Suddenly Howard asked the girl to guess Stanley's occupation. Sophie said that mental vibrations suggest to her that he travels a lot. Of course, Stanley wasn't convinced by this, as many people are on the move for work. Sophie continued to talk about Asia, but was embarrassed when Stanley objected to her. Stanley made up a story that he is supposedly in business, importing coffee from Brazil. The mother was quick to take her daughter away from this company. The woman did not like how Stanley was behaving so impudently. Meanwhile, Howard suggested Stanley see Sophie in action in order to finally expose her. The men have no doubt that Sophie is just a common fraudster. Grace Catledge reminds Mrs. Baker that Sophie promised to hold a seance for her. Mrs. Baker said that her daughter needs to catch the right vibrations. Right now, the woman is much more interested in the money that Grace has allocated for the construction of their foundation. Meanwhile, Bryce sings serenades about love to Grace. The girl is forced to listen to his terrible singing and smile. After his song, Bryce confessed his love to Sophie in hopes for reciprocity. However, Sophie says that she does not want to rush things. It's been tough for her and her mother, coming from a working-class background. Bryce told his beloved that from now on he will take care of her and buy her everything she wants. George, being a psychoanalyst, told his wife that Stanley is one of those people who believe in nothing and are skeptical about everything. That's why Stanley is the one they need. Meanwhile, Stanley met with Sophie, who is preparing to conduct a seance for Grace and communicate with her deceased husband. Stanley does not hide his skepticism and jokes sarcastically. When Stanley mentioned his Uncle Charles, who once fell victim to a fraudulent medium, Sophie suddenly went into a stupor and said that Charles's demise was somehow related to water. This plunged Stanley into confusion. He shared his doubts with Howard. Uncle Charles did indeed perish due to water. However, Stanley is not going to give up that easily. It was time for the seance. Sophie was about to contact Grace's late husband, Harry Catledge. Stanley and Howard watched this. Sophie went into a trance. At some point a clap was heard. Grace was happy, thinking her beloved husband was here. Sophie asked Harry to give her a sign. Suddenly the candle started levitating by itself. Howard, shocked, grabbed it, not understanding how this was possible since the candle was not attached by a string or a fishing line. Stanley was no less shocked, but he tried not to show his bewilderment. When everyone went to listen to music, Sophie told Stanley that she had a dream about a Chinese man who reminded her of the famous illusionist who would dress up as an Asian sorcerer. Stanley directly asked Sophie how she pulled off that trick. The man realized that Sophie had guessed that he was the illusionist. Sophie insisted that all her miracles were real. After that, Stanley met with Howard, Caroline and George, saying that Sophie was very good at her pretense. Nevertheless, Stanley was determined to do everything to expose her. He couldn't sleep all night, thinking about Sophie. The next morning Stanley joined her for breakfast and invited her to Provence to visit Aunt Vanessa. Sophie accepted his offer. While they were driving, Stanley asked Sophie if her conscience didn't bother her when she deceived naive people like Grace. Sophie was still trying to convince him that she was a real medium. Soon they stopped to have a snack. When Stanley asked Sophie where she was from, the girl replied that she was from Michigan. After that, Sophie talked about Stanley's childhood, who was born in London, and about his first unsuccessful marriage. This sounded quite convincing, but Stanley said he wouldn't fall for this trick because he was a rational person. They continued their journey, but often stopped because Sophie was a big fan of eating. When they reached their destination, Stanley introduced Sophie to Aunt Vanessa. Sophie unmistakably talked about Vanessa's illnesses. The woman was amazed, but Stanley said that this girl was just a charlatan. Although Sophie had eaten recently, she did not refuse a treat. Stanley continued to make sarcastic jokes, but Vanessa stood up for Sophie, considering her cute. When Sophie went to call Bryce, Stanley confessed to Vanessa that he began to doubt his sanity. He really does not understand how Sophie guesses different facts from people's lives. When Sophie returned, Stanley asked her to tell something about Vanessa's life. Sophie asked for some of her belongings to catch mental vibrations. The woman gave her pearl necklace. Sophie began to talk about events from a long time ago. Once upon a time, Vanessa was in love with a noble Englishman, a member of parliament, but he couldn't leave his wife. Both Vanessa and Stanley were in complete bewilderment. They don't understand how Sophie does it. Sophie also guessed that this necklace was given to Vanessa by her beloved at their last meeting. Now Stanley was completely convinced that Sophie was not a charlatan and that the spirit world exists. On the way back, Stanley asked Sophie when she realized she had a gift. The girl said she discovered these abilities in her youth. Since her father left her mother, Sophie began to earn a living with her gift. Suddenly the car stalled. Stanley reassured Sophie, assuring her that he would fix it, but several hours had passed and Stanley was unable to resolve the issue. A storm and rain started. Stanley and Sophie were forced to run and take shelter in an old observatory. To keep warm, Stanley embraced Sophie. He told her how as a child he loved coming to this place and staring at the stars, contemplating the vastness of the universe. Stanley dozed off. When he woke up, the rain had already stopped. Stanley opened the observatory roof, and a beautiful view unfolded before them. The magic of the moonlight was truly hypnotic, creating a romantic atmosphere. When they returned, Bryce wouldn't leave Sophie alone and constantly serenaded her with love songs. Their wedding is planned for the end of the summer. Full of enthusiasm, Bryce is making plans for their honeymoon and family life. To demonstrate the seriousness of his intentions, Bryce also gifted his beloved many beautiful dresses. Soon Sophie conducted another seance for Grace. The woman asked her late husband if he had always been faithful to her. It was a relief for her to learn that she was the only one for Harry. While Bryce is in Paris, Stanley and Sophie spend a lot of time together. During the day they swam in the sea by the cliffs, and in the evening they danced in the bar. The next day during their walk, they had philosophical conversations. Later, Stanley called the editor of a Berlin newspaper and said he had unique material for the next issue. A week flew by unnoticed. Sophie said that Bryce would return from Paris today. The girl is doubting whether she should marry him. Stanley thinks she should do it, as Bryce is wealthy and noble. For Sophie this is a chance. Soon a ball was held, attended by noble ladies and gentlemen from all around. Stanley's partner was Aunt Vanessa. Sophie of course was with Bryce, who didn't leave her for a second. However, she still managed to dance with Stanley. Later they went for a walk and had a conversation. Stanley confessed to Sophie that he admired her beauty. The man also said that he was having a press conference tomorrow, which would be specifically about her. Suddenly Sophie directly asked Stanley if he thought she was attractive. Stanley said that he was interested only in her unusual abilities, not her as a person. Moreover, Stanley was sure that if Sophie refused to marry Bryce, she would make a huge mistake. Disappointed by such an answer, Sophie left. The ball ended only at dawn. Stanley told Aunt Vanessa that Sophie had almost confessed her love to him. Vanessa immediately realized that her nephew also had feelings for Sophie. However, according to Stanley, they are not meant to be together because they are both engaged. Soon Stanley, who has spent a large part of his life exposing charlatans, spoke to reporters. He admitted that all these years he was wrong about occultism. Now Stanley confidently states that the world is not limited to only rational things. Now everyone is talking about Sophie. However, the triumph was interrupted by sad news. Stanley learned that his aunt had been in an accident and was in critical condition. Stanley rushed to the hospital immediately. The doctors said they were doing everything they could, but the chances were slim. Stanley was deeply upset because Vanessa had been like a mother to him. However, he was comforted by the fact that if the worst happens, he would be able to communicate with Vanessa's spirit through Sophie. Stanley had once scoffed at people who prayed in desperate situations, but now he found himself doing the same. He was ashamed of his past views on life, but now he believed that life had a higher meaning, and the universe a higher intelligence. Stanley asked God to save his beloved aunt, but at some point he realized it was completely absurd. He didn't recognize himself and began to think again that Sophie was a charlatan who had deceived him. Since Vanessa's surgery was successful, Stanley left. The first thing he did was to go to the Catledge family's cottage, where he stayed. Everyone believed that God had saved Vanessa. In response to this, Stanley began to sarcasm again. Because Stanley was very tired, he decided to go to sleep. When Howard was left alone with Sophie, he suggested opening champagne and celebrating the success of their scam. As it turned out, Howard and Sophie had been in cahoots all along. It was Howard who had provided the pseudo-medium all the facts of Stanley's life, as well as Vanessa's. However, Howard felt no guilt because deception was his profession. Moreover, Howard had always been envious of Stanley, who was a more successful illusionist. The fraudsters didn't expect Stanley to stay in the room using one of his tricks and overhear their conversation. Stanley had just recently suspected their deceit. It was Howard who grabbed that candle and assured him that there were no threads or fishing lines. For a moment, Stanley was ready to believe that miracles exist, and was happy. As it turned out, Howard had originally exposed Sophie and offered her a deal. Sophie still believes she is doing a good deed by convincing people of the existence of magic. It gives them hope, and Stanley experienced this firsthand. However, Stanley did not change his mind because he believes living a lie is wrong. Stanley refused to forgive Sophie and left. When Vanessa recovered, he picked her up from the hospital and took her home. Meanwhile, Bryce continued to plan the wedding trip. After talking to Olivia on the phone, Stanley promised he would return soon. However, Vanessa, who was aware of Sophie's scam, understood that Stanley was still in love with this girl. Stanley admitted he was thinking about Sophie. Perhaps harsh life circumstances forced her to deceive. Olivia is educated and very intelligent, but unlike her, Sophie has a special charm. For Stanley, this is unusual because he is used to always relying on logic. Vanessa said that in life one cannot rely solely on rationality, as things are a bit more complicated. Soon Stanley met with Sophie, who had already accepted Bryce's marriage proposal. Despite this, Stanley confessed his feelings to Sophie. He also said that he forgives her. Sophie said she regrets her actions, but she didn't expect to hear Stanley propose to her. Sophie can't agree to that because Bryce offered her a luxurious life and everything she ever dreamed of. Also, Sophie has no desire to spend her whole life with a man who doesn't believe in miracles. In the end, she left. Upset, Stanley got drunk in a bar with Howard. Stanley had already forgiven him, as Howard had opened his eyes to many things. Also, Stanley broke off his engagement with Olivia, who reacted to this very calmly. Stanley visited Vanessa again and said that Sophie had chosen Bryce over him, who is much wealthier and younger. This was a big blow for Stanley as he sincerely fell in love with Sophie. It turned out that the girl had been here all along and heard this conversation. She loves Stanley and is ready to marry him. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel not to miss more exciting new products. Also, the authors will be pleased if you leave your opinion in the comments.